Hey guys, I'm Heidi Priebe. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if this is your first time here. This week on this channel, we are talking about shadow work. So shadow work is essentially recognizing the parts of ourselves that we have shoved out of our own conscious awareness, but that are nonetheless impacting our lives in significant ways. Now, the term shadow work originally comes from Carl Jung, and Carl Jung talked about not just the personal shadow, so what we leave out of our awareness about ourselves and our personality, but also the collective shadow. So what we as a social group of any sort tend to neglect to accept and integrate into the kind of group identity. And as this week goes on, what I want to do is pick on some things that I think are in the collective shadow at this point in time. When something's in the collective shadow, it can actually be the scariest and most threatening to integrate that into our personal self-concept. Because being socially ostracized is a very real threat, right? We are social creatures, we have adapted to exist in social environments, and so we're all naturally going to be the most hesitant to accept the parts of ourselves that we believe would get us rejected from whatever social groups we're a part of. And today I want to directly address one of those experiences that I believe is currently in the collective shadow, which is the experience of admitting that you are wrong. So this could be either being literally factually wrong about something, so stating something or interpreting a set of data in a way that you later learned is not a reflection of the reality of that situation, or doing something that you or other people perceive to be morally wrong. If you have not been living under a rock for the past 10 years, you know that we live in the middle of cancel culture. And sometimes when we cancel someone, we are genuinely picking up on an antisocial pattern of behavior. So someone like Harvey Weinstein, who genuinely hurt a lot of people, it makes total sense to hold accountable for his actions. But there's also a kind of glee that you see very often, especially on the recesses of the internet, when someone famous does something that we even slightly consider to be morally wrong. And a lot of people will pretend, oh, I'm just looking out for the greater social good, when in reality, we are way over punishing even small transgressions. And or just not at all making room for a nuanced conversation about those transgressions, including when the person is genuinely wanting to do better. So this experience of being wrong, of saying the wrong thing or doing something that in hindsight is perceived as morally wrong, seems to be very much in the collective shadow. It is a social threat in many ways to admit that you are wrong because we are so ruthless about people doing a wrong thing. Again, even with relatively minor transgressions that people genuinely want to grow from. So it makes sense that for a lot of people in the current social environment we have, there is a giant threat response that comes online in the form of defensiveness when we start to even entertain the idea that maybe we have been wrong about something. When a threat response is online, we are not calmly rooting through the facts to figure out true from false. We are thinking about how to protect ourselves. And if the way to protect ourselves from being socially outcasted is to not be wrong, our mind is going to be working very quickly to try to convince us that we are not wrong, we are right, even if we kind of know deep down that that is not true. So in this video, what I want to do is talk about how we can learn to accept that we have done something wrong or stated something that is inaccurate while managing that social threat. Because that social threat is often quite real, and so pretending it's not doesn't really do anything for us. What we have to learn is to integrate the fact that that shadow exists, and so does each of our individual abilities to be wrong or to get something wrong or to make a mistake. And the problem is that when something is in the collective shadow, it really serves us to keep it in our personal shadow as well. Because again, we develop our shadow selves as a product of what is acceptable or not acceptable in our social environments. So if we want to create a society where we are more comfortable dwelling in nuanced conversations and allowing forgiveness and space for people to reconsider their beliefs without feeling defensive, my guess is that our best bet is to start doing that on a personal level so that it gets easier for us to translate that outwards. So, how do we work internally with the feeling of realizing we are wrong without canceling ourselves inside of our own minds? So what does that mean? It means keeping a sense of self-respect alive, even in the face of realizing that we have thought or done something wrong. And for the rest of the video, we're going to be talking about how to do exactly that. I personally believe that the number one way to kind of combat this fear of being wrong is learning to preserve your dignity in the face of recognizing that you are wrong. So refusing to listen to that kind of public opinion of, if you are wrong, it means you are a treacherous, terrible person who wants bad things to happen and who deserves to be shamed and outcasted. We have to learn to tell ourselves a new story about what it means to be wrong if we want to stand even half a chance at actually approaching our lives with moral and intellectual honesty. So what I view as kind of step one in the process of preserving your dignity in the face of realizing that you're wrong is learning to separate out what it actually feels like for you to realize that you are wrong about something from the experience of fawning. So, fawning is a threat response that comes online when we fear we are about to have some sort of really negative personal consequence as a virtue of what we have recently done. So if I say something that I believe to be true, and someone goes, "You're wrong," and starts laying into me about why I am wrong, I might interpret that as a very extreme social threat, depending on what kind of a relationship I have with this person, with myself, and with the information at hand. When we are in a fawn response, we are trying to keep ourselves safe at any cost. So our brains are not necessarily measuring the information carefully and methodically the way that we might be approaching the information when we are alone with it. If someone is yelling at us that we are wrong, we might freak out, listen to what they're saying, and our brain might find a way to convince us that they are right in that moment because we see agreeing with them and appeasing them as the only way to escape the threat. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean there's a real threat involved in us disagreeing with them, but it might. Right? There might be a very real social threat active in disagreeing with this person. So sometimes if we are very quickly changing our opinion on something because someone is angrily disagreeing with us, it's possible that we're in a fawn response. So we are feeling threatened versus the feeling of being wrong, of noticing that we have made an inaccurate evaluation of a scenario or we have made a mistake that we truly believe, even when we are alone with ourselves, to be a mistake, is a very different experience. And step one in learning to be wrong with dignity involves learning to separate out what is a fawn response from what is the feeling of genuinely realizing I have done something wrong. And this takes a lot of time and work to parse apart. A place I recommend starting is just noticing the situations in which you very quickly change your opinion about something and then later on go, wait a minute, now I feel very differently, or I see things very differently now that I have some space from that difficult interaction. I see now that I was actually just kind of appeasing this other person by buying into their side of things temporarily, even though in that moment I believed I was in the wrong. And if you can compile enough of these instances for yourself, you start to notice patterns around when you tend to fawn, ergo when you might be more susceptible to it. Also notice, what does it feel like in the moments when you are alone with yourself and you're realizing through reflection or through receiving new information that you missed a perspective and now you've changed your mind about something based on new information. Learn to tune in as much as you possibly can to the difference between those two situations so that you start to get a bigger picture that helps you distinguish in the future when you might be fawning and when it might be important for you to take a step back and consider the information at hand more deeply before giving a response, versus when you are genuinely realizing that you are wrong about something and you now truly, even when you are alone with yourself, believe something different. So when I'm wrong about something, I try to give myself the grace of first experiencing it as a quiet moment that I have with myself. So if I'm in a very heated interaction with someone else and I realize in the middle of that interaction, actually, I was wrong about this thing. And I know that because I can feel it in my body the same way I feel it when I am alone with myself, reevaluating old information. But if I think that admitting that in this moment is going to be met with a lot of shame or some very negative social consequence that I'm going to struggle to deal with, I give myself the grace of excusing myself from that interaction, saying that I need time to think, and then tending to that feeling within myself in a compassionate way, letting myself know that it's okay and safe in myself to be wrong about something, and that I am not going to criticize or judge myself for not getting things right initially. Which kind of naturally blends into the next step of this process, which is once you have realized you're wrong about something, as much as you're able to, separate out being wrong, having incorrect information or making a mistake, from the stories that you tell yourself about what it means about you as a person that you are wrong. So if you're not really sure what I mean by this, try taking out a notebook and just writing down the prompt, if I am wrong, that means ... and writing as quickly as you can whatever comes to mind that your instinctual self believes is going to be true about you if you make a mistake or get something wrong. Now, that does not mean that those things are true, but it's good to have an awareness of what you are conflating with the experience of being wrong. If I believe if I am wrong, it means I am a terrible person who doesn't deserve to have any friends or close relationships, I'm going to be working overtime to convince myself I am not wrong, even if I kind of know in my gut that I am, right? So separating out those stories can be really instrumental in the process of learning to accept when we are wrong by removing as much of the intrapersonal threat from it as possible. And it might be helpful in this process to just notice where those stories came from. Ask yourself why it may have been important for the people in your early environment to shame or blame or ostracize you when you were wrong. What threat response might have been online for those people that caused them to behave in that way? And can you unenmesh yourself from those threats that were active for them? And you can then apply that to the current experience of being wrong. So if other people in your environment genuinely seem to take glee or joy in the thought of you getting something wrong or making a mistake, that might be a very real social threat that is happening for you in real time. But you can also ask yourself, why is it so important to these people that I am wrong? And why does it seem to be important to them to dehumanize me as a result of my being wrong? And the reason you're doing this isn't to forgive other people for abusive or bullying behavior. It's so that you can separate out in your own mind someone else's projections from the truth about your character. Most of the time when people are arguing in these really intense, kind of high stakes, insulting ways, it's because both people have a very strong, very active story about what it means to be right or wrong about that thing. And a lot of it is really not that personal. At the end of the day, everyone is wrong sometimes. We are all, at various points in time, limited by our perspectives and the information that we currently have. We are always in some way lacking the full picture. That's just what it is to be alive. In reality, the art of being wrong and accepting and integrating new information is the art of being open to learning in a way that does not stagnate, which is an inherently cool way to live, in my opinion. It's not an undignified position. The people who are able to challenge their own perspectives, realize when they're wrong, and grow from that are the people who, in the long run, get the furthest in life. Someone else shaming you for being wrong almost definitely has way more to do with them than it does to do with you, but it doesn't always feel like that in the moment, which is why we need to take the opportunity to preserve our own self-respect and dignity in the face of realizing that we've been wrong about something. Which is exactly what step 3 in this process is: tend to your own dignity when you realize that you have gotten something wrong. Your dignity matters immensely in this moment, and there is nothing wrong with reminding yourself of that. In fact, I would actively encourage you to. Now, your dignity is not your narcissism, so it does not mean mounting your high horse. It means being able to maintain a sense of humility and self-respect simultaneously. So take some time to tend to your own emotions around the fact that you are wrong about something. It's okay to feel a bit bad for yourself and metabolize a little bit of shame or whatever else it is that you're feeling. Even if being wrong means that you owe an apology to someone else, I still think it's really important to first process it internally, or else the apology you give isn't going to be as integrated, ergo as effective, as the one that you could give if you have first regulated your own emotions around all of it. So instead of telling yourself the story, I was wrong, I'm an idiot, I always mess things up, I don't deserve any of the relationships I have, try telling yourself the true story. I was wrong because I was working with the information that I had at the time, which was incomplete. I was wrong because my thinking was biased in a way that I can now see more clearly. I was listening to the podcast of a friend of mine whose name is AJ Bond, who does a ton of work with toxic shame, and I will link it in the description of this video if you want to check that podcast out, where he was talking about how shame sometimes has us interpreting past actions as though we knew all along what was going to happen. So in psychology, we call this the hindsight bias. The idea that because we can see in retrospect how a series of events played out, we kind of project our current understanding of the situation onto our past selves and go, ooh, I knew it all along, right? When in reality, we didn't always know the outcome. Even if we knew that the outcome was one of the possible outcomes of what was going to happen if we pursued a given course of action, we probably didn't know for sure that it was going to turn out in the way that it did. But when shame comes online, it can be very easy to convince ourselves that we intentionally got something wrong or made a mistake. Because now, in light of new information, we see information that we had 2 weeks ago or a year ago or whatever it is in a new light, forgetting that at that point in time, the way we were interpreting that information was limited by the other information that we had. So just because we see something a different way now doesn't mean we were capable of seeing it that way back at the time when we were making these decisions around it. And that's a really important thing to remind ourselves of in order to preserve our own integrity and dignity when we are wrong. So I remember having this play out interpersonally one time, and I think that this is not an uncommon occurrence, where I was in a close relationship with someone, and I want to be clear that this just happens in relationships. Neither myself nor the other person had malicious intent in this interaction, but there's this issue we had been arguing about and not seeing eye to eye on for some time. And I was quite firm in my position. I was like, I really have some knowledge here that I believe you're not fully seeing, and I've been holding tight to that. And then we had this long conversation where throughout the course of the conversation, this person gave me a whole bunch of information that I didn't previously have. And at the end of the conversation, I was like, yeah, actually, I think you're right. What you're saying and your interpretation of this data makes more sense than my previous interpretation, even though for so long I was so hell-bent on my interpretation. I didn't say it as cleanly as that, but that was the gist of it. And then they looked at me and I imagine saw the opportunity to kind of get on a high horse a bit, again, as we all do sometimes, and went, yeah, and I can't believe you spent so long trying to convince me of the opposite. And I was like, well, I can believe I spent so long trying to convince you of the opposite because I've only known I was wrong for about 30 seconds. And I'm always only operating with the information that I have at the time. But in that moment, the other person was interpreting the hindsight bias to my actions. They weren't seeing it as I genuinely saw something one way for a period of time, new information changed my mind, and now I see it a different way. They were interpreting this as me finally admitting that they were right when I had known it all along, which was, of course, not the case. And we eventually got clear on that and laughed about it and let it go. But this type of thing plays out interpersonally and intrapersonally all of the time. We realize we're wrong or we admit we're wrong, and the other person or us automatically goes, you knew that all along because you had X, Y, and Z pieces of data that you're now acknowledging fit this side of things more so than this side of things. And everybody involved can quickly forget that at the time we were interpreting that same data in a different way because we had different pieces of information around it that made it look different. And we have to give ourselves the grace of recognizing that and not gaslighting ourselves into pretending that we knew things we couldn't possibly have known at a different point in time, and we're secretly behaving maliciously if that is not true. Even if we're recognizing that we were operating from a bias that caused us to interpret the data in a way that was not favorable to another person or whatever it is, that is also part of being human. It does not mean we are trash garbage people who don't deserve to have close relationship or whatever other story we're telling ourselves about what it means to have gotten something wrong. And once we can truly accept that, we can move on to step 4, which is integrate your wrongness. So figure out what led to you misinterpreting this data, which biases were at play, which information were you missing? What caused you to be wrong about this thing, either in terms of literal facts that you'd gotten wrong, or in terms of the structure around how you were interpreting the facts that led you to an incorrect conclusion. So I also want to bring this more into the human realm and look at it through the lens of, let's say, you thought you were doing something that was the right thing to do. Then you did it, and maybe someone who you were close with goes, hey, that thing really hurt me. And now you realize, ooh, that was not the most effective thing I could have done for maintaining this relationship. Or let's say you do something that you kind of know in the back of your mind the other person might not like, but you do it anyways. At this step, your job is to figure out why you did that thing. What need were you trying to fulfill that led you to behaving in a way or drawing some sort of conclusion that you now, in retrospect, think is wrong? And the important part here is that you have to actually think you're wrong for this part to work. It can't be a fawn response. So if you do something, you know it's a little bit selfish, but you're like, ooh, I kind of want to do it and I just hope my partner isn't going to get mad. And then your partner gets mad and you go, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I was wrong. You're not really integrating what happened there. And so your apology is probably going to be meaningless. Because if the part of you that behaved in a way you're deeming to be selfish was actually a deep need that's been going unmet for you for a long period of time that finally hit the override button on the rest of your moral code, it's highly likely that that is going to happen again if you don't spend the time figuring out what caused you to hit that override button and how you can avoid it happening again in the future. My personal, very firm stance on apologizing is that it's kind of useless to do it unless and until you are very clear on why you behaved the way you did, as well as how you can be certain you will not behave that way again in the future, using a means other than willpower to contest that behavior. You have to actually get down to the root of what was driving it and find a way to fulfill the need that was going unfulfilled that caused you to take the action that you now see as morally wrong. And that is when you know you have integrated that shadow element of yourself deeply enough that you can trust yourself to not behave the same way again in the future if the same need arises. If I got triggered and behaved in a way that was cruel or insulting towards another person, it's not over as soon as I go to the other person and go, I was triggered, I'm sorry. It's over when I have unpacked that trigger enough to know that when it becomes active again, I will not behave in the same way. So I have an alternate way of dealing with that trigger in the future. That's what it means to truly integrate the areas in which we have made a mistake or gotten something wrong. We figure out the true sequence of events, not the idealized sequence of events, the actual nitty-gritty, uncomfortable, ugly things that led to something happening that we believe is wrong. And we learn how to welcome those ugly things into our awareness for long enough to listen to what they need from us and learn to fulfill those needs in a healthier way. And if what we are wrong about is a more logical thing, it's not that dissimilar a process. We look at which beliefs or which biases or which thought patterns that maybe we're not proud of led us to interpreting the data in the way that we did, and develop some sort of internal process for catching ourselves when we might be thinking in that biased way. And then we know that we're unlikely to make that same type of error in the future. So once we have done that deep integration work, this leads us to the final point in the process, which is make amends for your wrongness without sacrificing your dignity. So again, this means taking responsibility only for that which you are responsible for. So it does not mean fawning. It does not mean going, I'm trash, I'm a terrible person, and buying into whatever other people or yourself believes being wrong means. It means acknowledging that you've made a mistake, that if it affected other people, it's likely you have remorse over it and you want to do something to right your wrong. But also being firm in the fact that you have reckoned with this mistake internally. You have really spent time getting familiar with why you made it, and you can offer people a clear perspective of why you won't make it again in the same conditions in the future. This is what it means to not just apologize, but to make true amends. Apologies are cheap, but amends take real, deep self-examination and humility. But a big part of being able to make true amends is knowing the limits of those amends. So being able to acknowledge the mistakes we made and the impact that those mistakes have on other people without blindly accepting all of these narratives that try to erase our humanity in the process. And again, this is easier to do the more honest we are with ourselves earlier on in the process. If we haven't really taken the time to consider in which ways we're wrong and what led to us being wrong, we're going to be more likely to fawn and accept whatever stories other people want to put on us about us being wrong, or get so defensive that the entire issue never gets dealt with, in which case both sides are going to continuously up the ante and tell more and more stories that take you both away from reality. In reality, we all get stuff wrong sometimes. It's important to acknowledge when we're wrong, both to ourselves and to the people involved, but there's nothing inherently shameful about getting something wrong in good faith. Or even a lot of the times in sketchy faith, right? We all have biases that lead us to interpret things in ways that are a little bit more favorable for the outcome that we want. That is part of being human. It happens to all of us. Even when you are wrong, even when you have messed something up, even when you have hurt other people through that being wrong, you still matter as a human being. You still have worth and you still have dignity. And keeping those things in mind, as counterintuitive as it might seem, actually makes it a lot easier to recover from your mistakes and repair the damage that you have caused. The more we can allow ourselves the opportunity to not kick ourselves off our own team when we realize we've done something wrong, the more we start to slowly change the overall social landscape of how we as a collective deal with other people being wrong. The personal and collective shadow are always deeply intertwined, which is probably a big part of where that phrase, "be the change you want to see in the world," comes from. So if you would like to see a world where humility is easier to practice and where people can genuinely put their egos down and learn from each other with forgiveness when people get things wrong or make mistakes, it starts with giving yourself that patience and forgiveness when you have made a mistake, and showing the same type of grace to yourself that you would like to extend to others. All right, that's all I have to say for today on the topic of being wrong while keeping your dignity intact. A big part of why I wanted to make this video is because as we encounter shadow content, so as we go through the other days of this week and we start looking at part of ourselves we're not happy with or we're now interpreting through a different light, it's important to keep in mind that we need to be practicing compassion and respect for ourselves in that process, lest we let our defenses take over and refuse to integrate information that could make our lives a lot better if we were willing to look at it. But that is all I have to say for today on this topic. Let me know in the comments, as always, what you're thinking, feeling, what your questions are. I love you guys. I hope you're taking care of yourselves and each other and your inner children who get a lot of things wrong. And I will see you back here again really soon.